The door to the private study didn't just open. It swung inward with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who owned every room he entered and every silence he chose to fill. Hazel Voss hadn't heard him coming. She'd been hunched over the mahogany credenza in the corner, pressing a folded linen napkin against the cut above her eyebrow, convinced that at 2:15 in the morning, the entire east wing of the Caruso estate was empty. She'd been wrong. "Don't move." His voice came from the doorway, low, unhurried, with the particular authority of someone who had never once needed to repeat himself. Nico Caruso stood with one hand still resting on the brass door handle, his dark charcoal suit jacket folded over his forearm, his dress shirt open at the collar. He smelled of November rain and something expensive she couldn't name. His eyes, dark, still, and deeply unsettling, weren't on the room. They were on her, or rather on the napkin she was pressing to her face, which had already bloomed a vivid, incriminating red. Hazel went rigid. Every instinct she'd developed over the past 7 months of working in this house told her the same thing. Disappear. Be invisible. Don't give him a reason to look at you. It was 11 months too late for that. "Mr. Caruso," she said, stepping back, dropping the napkin behind her hip. "I apologize. I was just leaving. I'll lock up behind me." I said, "Don't move." He stepped into the room. The door clicked shut at his back. He crossed the distance between them in 8-9 steps, deliberate, unhurried, a man with nowhere else to be at 2 in the morning, except exactly where he was. He stopped close enough that Hazel could see the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension held in the line of his jaw. He reached out and gently, devastatingly gently, moved her hand away from her face. The cut wasn't deep, but the bruising around it was already purpling along her cheekbone, tender and swollen from the force of the blow she'd taken 40 minutes ago in the parking garage on the north side of the property. Nico Caruso looked at it for a long, terrible moment. "Who did this?" he said, not a question, a verdict waiting to be rendered. Hazel Voss had not planned to spend her 28th year as a live-in housekeeper at a fortified estate on the outskirts of Vancouver. 2 years ago, she had been a second-year paramedicine student at BCIT, pulling double shifts at a downtown cafe to cover tuition, living in a shared apartment in Commercial Drive with 3 roommates and a dying succulent she kept forgetting to water. Her younger brother, Owen, had been 17, skateboarding, failing chemistry, eating everything in the fridge, annoying her constantly, and absolutely vital to her continued existence in the way that only a little brother you've raised since your mother left can be. Then Owen had made a catastrophic, stupid, irreversible decision. He'd borrowed $40,000 from a man named Gregor Holt. Gregor Holt was not the kind of man you borrowed money from. He ran a private lending operation out of a restaurant supply warehouse in Burnaby. One of those businesses that exists to launder money for the Marchetti network, the West Coast syndicate that had controlled Vancouver's ports, its construction unions, and its underground gambling circuit for nearly 30 years. Owen had needed the money fast. A friend of his had gotten into serious trouble, the kind that required immediate cash and no questions. And Owen, being 17 and reckless and good-hearted in the worst possible way, had walked into Gregor Holt's orbit and walked out $30,000 lighter in the long run, because the interest alone was annihilating. By the time Hazel found out, the debt had compounded to $62,000. Owen was 18. They'd threatened to break both his hands. Hazel had dropped out of school that same week. The job came through a private staffing agency that operated out of a suite in a Yaletown tower, and asked very specific questions about discretion, loyalty, and the candidate's willingness to sign a non-disclosure agreement that covered every conversation she might ever overhear, every room she might ever enter, and every face she might ever see. The pay was extraordinary, more than 3 times what she'd earned at the cafe. The position was housekeeper and occasional household coordinator at a private estate in West Vancouver, owned by a man named Nico Caruso. Hazel had heard the name. Most people in Vancouver who paid attention to things that weren't meant to be paid attention to had heard the name. Nico Caruso was 36, Italian-Canadian by heritage, publicly registered as the CEO of a real estate development and maritime logistics firm called Caruso North. He appeared at charity galas. He sat on the board of 2 hospitals. He wore impeccable suits and gave measured, carefully worded interviews to the business press. He was also, by every whispered account Hazel had collected over 7 months of working inside his walls, the operating head of the Caruso family's Pacific operations, the successor to his father, who had built the network from nothing in the 1980s and retired to a house in Victoria with an oxygen tank and a view of the ocean. The head housekeeper, a composed, unsmiling woman named Mrs. Arnett, had met Hazel at the service entrance on her first morning and given her 2 rules. The first, she was to complete her duties without being seen or heard. The second, she was never under any circumstances, to enter the east wing of the main house without explicit instruction. For 7 months, Hazel had followed both rules without exception. She had learned the rhythms of the estate the way you learn the habits of a weather system, by watching, adjusting, and staying out of the way. She knew that the formal dining room was used for meetings that lasted past midnight on Thursdays. She knew that the men who arrived in silver SUVs through the north gate were not guests. She knew to finish the east corridor before 6 a.m. because Mr. Caruso ran the full length of it twice before breakfast and did not appreciate company. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times. Each time he had not seen her. She was furniture. She was a ghost in rubber-soled shoes and a grey uniform, and she had preferred it that way, until the night Gregor Holt's collector found her in the parking garage. His name was Dex, no last name offered, none expected. He was a thick-necked man in a waterproof jacket who smelled of cigarettes and convenience store coffee, and he had been waiting beside her second-hand Civic when she came down to retrieve her forgotten phone charger at 1:45 in the morning. "Your brother's behind again," he said. "Owen's payment went out on the 15th. Hazel said, keeping her voice level. "I have the transfer confirmation." The rate change, Dex shrugged, as if this were a minor administrative inconvenience. Gregor adjusted for market risk. "You're short by 8,000. That's not the agreement. The agreement is whatever Gregor says it is." He stepped closer. "You've got until Friday or Owen goes back to work for us." "Which isn't the kind of work a 19-year-old wants." "Don't?" Hazel started, reaching for her phone. He slapped it out of her hand. Then, when she bent to grab it, he shoved her forward, hard enough that she hit the concrete pillar face first, the corner of it catching her above the eyebrow in a burst of white pain. By the time her vision cleared, Dex was gone. The garage was empty. Her phone screen was cracked, and her face was bleeding into her palm, and the terror of what was coming, for Owen, for her, for all of it, pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. She didn't go back to the staff quarters. She couldn't. She ended up in the East Wing study instead, which was unlocked because the secondary cleaning team had been there at midnight, and the latch was stiff, and she hadn't even thought about where she was walking. She'd just needed somewhere quiet and still, and not her own four walls. And then Nico Caruso had come home. "I bumped into a pillar in the garage," Hazel said, the lie sliding out of pure survival instinct. "It was dark. I wasn't paying attention." His expression didn't change. He reached past her, opened the top drawer of the credenza, and removed a first aid kit that had no business being that well stocked. He set it on the desk without a word. "Sit down," he said. "Mr. Caruso, I really should. Sit down, Hazel." The sound of her name in his voice stopped her completely. In 7 months, he had never used her name. She had been girl to Mrs. Arnett, the housekeeper to the security team, and invisible to Nico Caruso himself. She sat. He pulled a sterile wipe from the kit, tore it open with quiet efficiency, and crouched in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the faint silver threading at his temples, and the old, faded scar along his left jaw that his public photographs were always carefully angled to avoid. "I've worked around violence my entire life," he said, his voice even and low, his attention focused on the cut above her brow with a precision that made her feel pinned to the chair. "I know exactly what a concrete pillar does to a face, and I know exactly what a hand does." He pressed the wipe to the cut, clean and careful. Hazel hissed through her teeth. He didn't apologize, but he slowed. "So I'm going to ask you once. Who was in that garage?" The walls of 7 months' careful self-preservation were thinner than she'd thought, or maybe it was the pain or the exhaustion or the particular quality of his voice. Not loud, not threatening, but utterly immovable. "A collector," she said, the words scraping out of her. "He works for a man named Gregor Holt." Nothing moved in Nico's expression. He applied a thin strip of steri-strip across the cut with the same practiced focus. "Holt operates out of Burnaby," he said, almost to himself. "Marchetti's sub-network, commercial debt and informal lending." He looked up. His eyes were very dark and very close. "Why does a Marchetti collector have business with my housekeeper?" And because the alternative was drowning alone, Hazel told him. All of it. Owen's loan, the compounded interest, the 70% of her salary she sent to Gregor Holt's account every second Friday. The way the rate kept shifting, the way the threats kept escalating. She told him in a flat, controlled voice, because if she let the emotion in, she would fall apart entirely, and she could not afford that. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You've been funneling a Marchetti payment out of this property for 7 months, Nico said. "Yes, and tonight, Holt sent a man to my grounds. She hadn't thought of it that way. The garage was technically Caruso property. Yes. I didn't tell them where I worked. I swear I didn't. They must have followed me or the agency. Stop." He stood, turned, walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the rain-slicked grounds below. His hands were flat on the windowsill. She watched the tension move through his shoulders like weather. When he turned back, his voice had shifted, still quiet but with an edge underneath it, precise and cold as a scalpel. "The North Gate," he said. "It runs biometric access and a rotating pin issued every 8 hours. You don't have clearance for the North Gate. Neither does your collector." He paused, which means he didn't come through security. He was let through. The silence that followed was so absolute Hazel could hear the rain hitting the glass. "Someone opened the gate for him," Nico said. "Someone inside this property." He moved quickly after that. He picked up a matte black phone from the desk, not the one he carried publicly, and made a single call, 3 words, "Lock it down." Hazel watched from the leather chair as the estate transformed around her. There were no alarms, no flashing lights. It was quieter and more frightening than that. The exterior lights shifted from ambient to tactical, low, directional, flooding the grounds in cold white. The sound of the north and south gates engaging reached them even through the study's thick walls. A man appeared in the doorway minutes later. He was lean, mid-40s, with grey-streaked hair and the careful stillness of someone trained to stay calm when everyone else wasn't. This was Reed Stafford, she would later learn. Nico's deputy, the man who ran the operational side of everything the public-facing company didn't cover. "Perimeter is sealed," Reed said, his eyes moving briefly to Hazel's face before returning to Nico. "Thermal sweep is clean inside the fence line. Whoever came through the north gate is gone. Pull the gate access logs, every credential used in the last 4 hours. And bring Sasha and Marco to the operations room, separately. Phones confiscated before they enter." Reed's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Both of them?" "Both." After Reed left, the room was very still. Nico looked at her again, the kind of look that took inventory without being unkind. "By the terms of how this world operates," he said, "what you've done is a significant breach. A rival network's operative gained access to Caruso property because of your connection to them." He paused. "I should consider that a liability." Hazel's throat tightened. "But Holtzman put his hands on you in my garage." His voice remained even, but something underneath it had gone very cold. "And what happens to the people under this roof is my concern, not his." He moved to the door. "Stay in this room, don't leave." He was gone before she could find a response. The operations room was located below the main floor, accessible through a key-coded door behind the wine cellar. It was a windowless space with the temperature of a server room. Cool, humming, ringed with monitors, displaying feeds from every camera on the property. The steel table in the center held 2 coffee cups that hadn't been there an hour ago. Marco Tessari sat on the left, broad, composed, the kind of man who processed his nerves by going very still. He managed the estate's physical security and had been with Nico for 6 years. Sasha Veld sat on the right, fingers interlaced on the table. She was 32, razor-sharp, responsible for coordinating logistics and internal communications across the entire Pacific operation. She'd transferred from the Toronto side of the family 2 years ago at her own request. Their phones were in a tray in the corner. Nico didn't sit. He paced behind them both, unhurried, which was considerably more unnerving than anything louder. "At 1:49 this morning," he said, "a March-affiliated collector entered the north parking garage through the estate's secure perimeter. He assaulted a member of the household staff, and then he left. He let that sit for a moment. The north gate requires biometric verification and a time-limited pin. It wasn't breached. It was opened." Marco's jaw tightened. "If one of my rotation team—" "Your rotation team doesn't have Northgate override authority," Nico said smoothly. "That's a restricted credential." "Reed, logs are up," Reed said from his position at the monitors. "Northgate opened at 1:37 a.m. Biometric match confirmed. Pin authenticated." He looked up. "The credential belongs to Sasha." The room compressed. "That's impossible," Sasha said, her voice controlled but her knuckles going white. "My biometric is registered to me. They can't clone a palm scan, Nico. Someone is setting me up. The Moschettis have been trying to get a wedge into this operation for—" "I know," Nico said. "Then you understand this is a frame?" "I understand you didn't open the north gate tonight," Nico replied, walking slowly around the table until he was standing behind her. "Because Reed pulled the secondary feeds. While Holt's man was in the garage, you were in the communications hub on the 2nd floor. A pause, the kind that had weight to it, pulling the encrypted routing files for our Kelowna transfer accounts." Sasha went very still. "The gate was opened with a credential cloned from a handprint lifted off your keypad, something that required inside access." Nico continued, "You've been working with Holt for 3 months. He was feeding you Marchetti intelligence on our Kelowna exposure in exchange for operational details on this property. You gave him a pathway onto the ground so his collector could run an errand, small enough not to trigger a full sweep, while you had 14 minutes of unmonitored access to the transfer files." "Nico, The accounts have already been frozen, he said. Raid noticed the discrepancy in the Kelowna records 6 days ago. We've been watching. The sound that reached Hazel in the study, muffled through the floor and 2 reinforced doors, was short and definitive. She didn't move. She sat with her knees drawn up in the leather chair, her hands pressed together, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its absoluteness, that she was inside something she could not negotiate her way out of. She could only wait. Nico returned to the study 40 minutes later. He'd removed his shoulder holster, though she could see the indentation of the strap against his shirt. He went to the bar cabinet, poured 2 fingers of something amber, and drank it standing with his back to her. "The breach has been addressed," he said. Hazel nodded. Once, he turned. He looked at her in the quiet, thorough way that she was starting to recognize, not assessing her as a threat or a problem, but as something he was trying to understand. "You're afraid of me," he said. "Yes," she said, because lying to him again felt both useless and somehow worse than the truth. "That's reasonable." He walked toward her and stopped at the edge of the Persian rug, leaving space between them. "But I want you to understand something, Hazel. Holt sent a man onto Caruso property to collect a debt that was manufactured from nothing, compounded and inflated to keep you locked into payment indefinitely. He never intended for you to pay it off. You are more valuable to him as a permanent source of income than as a closed account." He paused. "Owen's debt is done. I'll take care of it by morning." She stared at him. "Why?" The question came out before she could stop it. Blunt and raw and honest, something shifted in his expression. Not softened, that wasn't quite the right word. Clarified, maybe. "Because Gregor Holt put his hands on someone in my house," he said. "And because you have been quietly bleeding for 7 months to protect your brother, and no one noticed, and I find that intolerable." He paused. "And because the Marchettis have been looking for a reason to move against this operation for 2 years, and now I have every reason to move against them instead." A knock at the door. Reed quiet and efficient as always. "The operations teams are assembled, Nico. We're ready for the briefing. 1 minute." Nico looked at her. "Get some sleep. Mrs. Arnett will move your things to the East Wing in the morning." "I don't need. You're a material witness to a security breach on this property. You don't leave my sight until I've stabilized the situation." The firmness in it left no room. He paused in the doorway. "Your brother is going to be fine, Hazel. You have my word." He was gone before she could tell him that, somehow, she already believed him. She was moved to a room in the East Wing that was 4 times the size of her staff quarters and had a window that looked out over the Strait of Georgia. Mrs. Arnett delivered a tray of tea and toast at 7 a.m. and informed her, in a voice that had entirely lost its edge, that Owen had been collected by 2 of Mr. Caruso's men at 5 that morning and transferred to a private suite in a hotel in Gastown. An armed escort would remain with him. Gregor Holt would not reach him there. The crushing weight that had sat on Hazel's sternum for 2 years lifted so suddenly it felt like vertigo. She was dressed and in the main hall within the hour, because, whatever came next, she was not going to sit in a comfortable room and wait for other people to decide things on her behalf. The estate had transformed overnight into something that felt genuinely military. The men who moved through the corridors now wore tactical gear rather than the discreet suits of the security team. Monitors had been rolled into the main conference room. There was a persistent, focused tension in the air that was neither panic nor aggression. It was preparation. Nico was in the solarium, standing over a long table covered in maps, aerial photographs, and a cluster of encrypted tablets. Reed was beside him. 2 other senior members of the operation flanked the table. They all stopped when she entered. "Sit," Nico said, gesturing to the chair beside him, which was not the chair on the periphery. It was the chair at the table. She sat. He didn't explain why she was included. He simply continued. "Gregor Holt operates 3 primary revenue streams for the Marchetti network in the Lower Mainland," Nico said. "Informal lending, which we've just eliminated 1 node of. Supply chain skimming through the Burnaby warehouse complex. And private enforcement, which is what Holt used against Hazel's brother. He tapped 3 locations on the map. We move against all 3 simultaneously tonight." He outlined the operation with the same focused calm he appeared to bring to everything. The Burnaby warehouse. A coordinated interception of their monthly ledger transfer, which would expose the skimming to the Marchetti senior network and trigger an internal fracture. The lending database, stored on a localized server in a Coquitlam office park, would be destroyed, erasing every outstanding debt Holt held, including Owen's. Holt himself would be delivered alive to a location of the Marchetti family's choosing, which would serve as both an offering and a message. "You're starting this because of what happened to me," Hazel said quietly when he finished. "I'm accelerating what was already coming," he said, leaning down slightly so his voice didn't carry past her. The Marchettis have been attempting to destabilize this operation for months. Sasha's betrayal and last night's incursion gave me the justification and the intelligence I needed to move. His eyes held hers. You were not the cause, Hazel. You were the person caught in the middle. There's a difference. Raid cleared his throat carefully from across the table. The Marchetti network has enforcement contacts inside the RCMP's organized crime unit. If we move this aggressively, there's a possibility of an institutional response. I have a meeting with someone at the federal level tomorrow morning, Nico said, straightening. It will be fine. Prep the teams. The hours after dark were the worst Hazel had ever spent. She was confined to the East Wing, nominally for her safety, actually because she would have been a liability on the street, and she understood that. The two men stationed outside her door were polite and completely immovable. She paced. She made tea she didn't drink. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall and thought about Owen eating room service in a hotel in Gastown, safe and furious, and probably texting her constantly on the replacement phone Reed had sent him. The encrypted radio on the East Wing desk, left there for her, she realized, because Nico had anticipated that she would not sleep and had decided she deserved to know, crackled to life at 11:17. Operations 1 and 2 complete. Burnaby warehouse is sealed. Coquitlam server is down. The debt registry is gone. Hazel pressed a hand over her mouth. Owen was free. The number that had haunted her for 2 years, that had cost her school and sleep and 2 years of her life, simply didn't exist anymore. 10 minutes later, the radio crackled again, and the voice on the other end was sharp and static fractured and wrong. Base, this is Ridge team at the Holt handoff point. It's a setup. Marchetti heavies were waiting. We're taking fire. Nico is hit. Repeat, Mr. Caruso is down. The radio hit the floor. Hazel was already moving. She got past the guards on pure forward momentum. Get out of my way. He's been shot, move. And ran for the estate's medical room, which she'd located in her first week, out of the same professional instinct that made her memorize fire exit routes. The medical room was a full trauma bay behind a steel door off the east corridor. She broke it open with the keypad code she'd read over Mrs. Arnett's shoulder 2 months ago, because Hazel Voss paid attention to things, and she used 12 minutes to do everything she could before the trucks came back. She prepped IV lines, laid out trauma dressings in order of use, assessed the available supplies with the part of her brain that had been built at BC-8 and never fully gone dormant, even when she was scrubbing floors and polishing credenzas and pretending to be invisible. The vehicles came in through the underground garage at 11:54. Reed came through the door first, his coat blood-soaked. Nico came in behind him, supported by 2 of his men, pale, jaw set, one hand clamped over his left side, still standing, still upright and still present in a way that was either extraordinary willpower or sheer refusal to do otherwise. Table, Hazel said in a voice she barely recognized as her own. Nico's eyes found hers. Even then, grey-faced and bleeding, there was something in his expression that wasn't quite surprise, but was near it. He let his men move him to the table without argument, which Reed later told her was the first time in living memory that Nico Caruso had done what he was told in a medical situation without negotiating first. Everyone out, Nico said. Perimeter, you need. Reed started. Out. She was alone with him in 30 seconds. Left side, she said, already cutting through the shirt with the surgical scissors from the tray. I need to see it, he released his hand. The wound was a deep graze along his lower ribs. Not penetrating, not arterial, but ugly and heavy with blood loss. She assessed it in 5 seconds and felt the specific of not fatal manageable. I can do this. It's a graze, she said. Deep, but the cavity isn't compromised. You need sutures and fluid replacement. Then do it. She prepped the local anesthetic, aware with the whole surface of her skin that he hadn't looked away from her face since she started working. Someone in the handoff team fed Holt's people the location, he said, while she cleaned the wound. He didn't flinch. Sasha wasn't the only Marchetti asset inside the operation. How many people knew the handoff location? 4. Reed, myself, and 2 others. He paused, one of whom volunteered for the assignment. She pressed clean gauze to the wound. Who? I'll know by morning. His hand moved large and warm and careful and closed around her wrist, stilling her. The contrast between his hands and his voice, the violence and precision of the world he occupied, and the quality of his attention when he looked at her, made her breath catch in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely know what to do with. You're shaking, he said. You're bleeding on my floor, she replied. And then, because that was his line, the thing he'd said to her this morning, a lifetime ago, a sound escaped her that was almost a laugh and mostly relief. Something moved in his expression. She felt it more than saw it. Owen is safe, he said quietly. The debt is gone. Holt is in Marchetti custody and is no longer a problem that will ever reach either of you again. I know. Her voice came out unsteady. I know, and I don't. I don't know how to. You don't owe me a transaction, he said. That's not what this is. She looked at him. In the flat white light of the trauma room, with his shirt cut open and his expression unguarded, in a way that the rest of his life didn't appear to, he looked less like the man who ran an empire, and more like a person who was very tired and very determined, and possibly not entirely sure what he was doing either. What is it then? She asked. He looked at her for a long moment. His thumb moved once across the pulse point of her wrist. Something I haven't figured out a name for yet, he said. But I intend to. The second leak took 48 hours to surface, and it came the same way the truth usually comes. Not through interrogation or surveillance, but through a single unguarded moment of assuming the wrong person wasn't listening. Hazel was in the main kitchen Thursday morning, making coffee for the operations team, when one of Nico's senior couriers, a quiet man named Fletcher who managed the intercity communications runs, came in looking for a bottle of water. They'd made small talk once or twice in her months at the estate. He was the kind of person who moved through rooms without drawing attention, which was something she'd respected. Rough week, he said, leaning against the counter. Glad your brother's okay. That clinic up in North Van must be a relief. Good that they moved him there. Hazel didn't pause. She finished pouring the coffee and set the pot down and said, yes, much better. And then she stood very still and thought about what she'd just heard. Owen wasn't in a clinic in North Vancouver. Owen was in a hotel in Gastown. Reed had told her the location directly. The only people who knew it were Nico, Reed, and the two men who'd collected Owen. Fletcher was not one of those people. She walked out of the kitchen with a tray of coffee and delivered it to the solarium and set it on the table, and then looked at Nico across the room and said quietly and clearly, the room went still. She told him what she'd heard. The exact words, the exact phrasing, the detail that was wrong. Nico looked at her for a moment with an expression that she could only describe as something that had been decided. He was already speaking to Reed before she finished. Change the schedule for tonight, Nico said. We bring Fletcher into the meeting on the Kelowna run. Let him hear the revised pickup location. He looked at Reed. Then we wait and see who shows up. The Marchetti contact arrived at the wrong location at 10:40 that night and found Nico's people waiting for him. Fletcher was taken into custody by the team before midnight. By 1 in the morning, the full scope of the secondary leak had been mapped and neutralized. The Marchetti Network's Vancouver operation, stripped of its inside access and its primary financial infrastructure, quietly collapsed over the following 72 hours in a way that made the news only as a vague report about an ongoing RCMP investigation into organized financial fraud. Nico came home at dawn. Hazel was waiting in the main foyer. She hadn't planned to be. She'd been walking toward the kitchen, and he'd come through the front door, and they'd simply ended up in the same place at the same time, which had been, she realized, the fundamental nature of everything that had happened between them. He looked exhausted. His coat was damp with early morning rain, and he moved carefully, conscious of his stitches, but he was whole and upright and present, and something in her chest unlocked at the sight of it in a way she didn't try to hide. She crossed the foyer and put her arms around him. He stilled for a fraction of a second, surprised, she thought, in the way of someone who hadn't been held in a very long time. And then both his arms came around her, one hand at her back and one at the back of her head, and he held her with the same focused, unhurried attention he gave to everything. It's over, he said against her hair. I know, she said. Your brother can come home whenever he's ready. She pulled back enough to look at him. His eyes were very dark and very close and completely unguarded in the morning light in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen Mrs. Arnett called me Miss Voss this morning, Hazel said. She'll be calling you that from now on, he said. And the way he said it, quiet, certain as if it were simply a fact about the future that had already been decided, made something warm and irreversible settle in her chest. She'd come to this estate as a ghost, a girl trying to disappear into someone else's walls and survive long enough to get her brother out of harm's reach. She had expected nothing. She had planned for nothing beyond the next payment, the next errand, the next week of being invisible. Instead, she had been seen, and the man who had seen her had dismantled an empire because of it. Not for her, not exactly, but because of something that lived in the space between obligation and choice, something that didn't yet have a name but was building one, quietly and deliberately, the way he did everything. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had sutured a crime lord's wounds, unmasked two traitors, and freed her brother from a debt that should have crushed them both. She didn't know what came next, but for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't afraid to find out.